It's now time to move on to our panel debate. So can I hand over now to Jonathan Roberts to introduce our panellists and to kick off the next phase of this event. Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Guy, and thank you to all the speakers. So to my immediate right here, we've got Rob Oxley. Rob is the Campaign Director for Business for Britain. Rob had the grave misfortune of being stuck on a train for 8 hours next to me earlier this year. So I'm so sorry, Rob, you're having to sit next to me all over again. I promise it won't be quite as long as last time. He's also the author of Change or Go, which is this war and peace looking text next to me. We've also got Paddy Rogers, the Chief Executive of Euronav, I think the world's largest publicly listed crude tanker company. And Paddy was recently shortlisted for Newsmaker of the Year at this year's Lloyd's List Awards. Good luck. If you haven't voted yet, you can. Go on the website. We're all rooting for you, Paddy. And to my left here, we've got Laura Sands, the Chair of the European Movement. As well as being the Chair of the European Movement, she's the former MP for South Thanet. And the Times paid her the greatest honour that could ever befall a parliamentarian by calling her one of the sanest of all MPs. I'll leave you to insert your own jokes. OK, the way this will work is that each of the three panellists will speak for up to 5 minutes, expressing their views on the question, and then we'll open up to questions from the floor. So why don't we start with you, Paddy? Can the EU change, and should it?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I guess that I'm here for the light relief, as I'm the least intellectually competent of the people you're going to hear. But I have gone through a business career which has meant that Euronav is a Belgian company. We're listed on the New York Stock Exchange and also on Euronext. We have offices in Antwerp, which is the headquarters. We have a French crewing office in France, in Nantes, which is looks like something of an anachronism to many people, but in fact is very highly qualified staff, well functioning. We have most of our operations, in fact, run on the technical side in Greece, and we have commercial operations in London, where we've been innovative in the formation of a cooperative with a number of other shipping companies and oil traders for selling space on board our ships. I think in many ways we feel like an archetypal success story for melding together many different talents in a European environment. So I'm pleased to note that it's the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. I think it's important because sometimes I think when we hear the battles that England's going to fight in Europe, it sounds more appropriate to that age than this. I think that the result of the Battle of Waterloo, it seems to me, was also the formation of Belgium, which was designed by the English to annoy the French. And I think it's done it successfully for a couple of centuries now. But joking apart, we look at the big things that were talked about and the things that really matter, particularly by John Mills and also by David Dingle, was the political motive and the great success story. And the great success story is this was a union built in the ruins of the Second World War. This is a union which effectively expanded to include outlying nations. It's a union that successfully expanded to include 3 former dictatorships, Greece, Portugal and Spain. It's a union that expanded to take on board the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it's a union that is going to successfully integrate, I'm sure, the post-war, post-conflict Balkans. So I think that whatever we're doing, we shouldn't lose sight of the huge political success. And whilst the union has been very led in that European undemocratic social architecture manner, it's often taken steps of great bold leadership way beyond the institutions necessary to deliver. So running behind that political will has been the creation of institutions which didn't really look fit for purpose. But a huge amount of work has been done to deal with the issues that they weren't fit to deal with. And I think that the one thing I'd really like to focus on, of course, is the euro, because for us that's made our business management of so many offices successful and effective, because we've been able to use just one currency rather than 4. It's been interchangeable use of staff as they move between those offices. It's been holistic management of the total crew services on board, and we still use Belgian flag, French flag and Greek flag. I'm sorry to say we don't use British flag. Why? Because in Britain we didn't look after our seafarers. So it's been an environment which has nurtured core things very important to our business, and it's been a great success story for us. It's had huge struggles. Obviously this year we've only really had two big stories as far as I'm concerned this summer. The two that have really been in my mind have been, was there going to be a Brexit? And was this going to be the unzipping of the euro? And as a result of that, the boiling down perhaps of the European Union, instead of being a European ideal, into being a kind of Großdeutschland, where the surviving bit would be Benelux, maybe Germany, and perhaps Poland and some Baltic states, because these were the countries that seemed to be the most dynamic. Or was it going to stay as a European ideal? What have we found? Well, what we found is there's a huge amount of work done in order to try to deal with the issues that have been thrown up by convergence, by a single currency. And unfortunately, what's the result? It's going to mean there is going to be greater political union. That is inevitable. And when it happens, the question isn't going to be, and what do the British think about this? Quite frankly, we're voting to try now to do something, but to talk about leadership or changing, everything is running ahead. Everything is way beyond. The train has left the station. We're trying to have a debate here about Brexit, which we should have had in 1985, 10 years after 1975, not now. And we're going to come to a gunfight with a knife. The second big story has been immigration, and what are we going to do? Come back and talk about maybe taking a few thousand children, if we can, and then worrying about the fact that too much immigrant labour is coming into the country and keeping labour rates down in the UK. And I think that I fully agree that these are big challenges, and I'm not sure that the union's equipped to deal with them at the moment, but they go way beyond the scale of our complaints or the solutions that we're bringing. So Europe is going to thrust ahead. It will be resilient. It will be successful. The question is, where are we going to stand in relation to it? And I think what we've heard is that maybe the best place is a little to the side.
Thank you for that. And straight on to Rob.
Well, the premise of this question, can the EU change and should it? There's three parts of that I think we need to talk about. Firstly, what are we discussing? It's the EU. We're not discussing Europe. We're about to have a very fundamental conversation in this country about not only the direction of this country, but the direction of the EU. And I think too often the language is sometimes blurred on this, and we talk about Europe as if Britain, by voting to potentially leave in this referendum, will leave Europe. It won't leave Europe. It will maybe leave the European Union. And there's some very big questions about that. But I do think before we get there, I agree with the Prime Minister that before you make up your mind whether you're in or out, you should consider what kind of relationship we could have with the European Union. So my question on this is I will focus on, should the EU change before I talk about whether it can? And I think absolutely. I hope it can. I think Britain's relationship with the European Union has to be put on a sustainable basis. It currently isn't. Change will go. Something which encapsulates Business for Britain's position and also a publication. I can't claim to have been the author of it, only the person who had to explain it to the media and many others. Change Will Go sets out not only Business for Britain's position, but a position that I think Britain should be taking in this debate. That if we secure certain changes in our relationship, that actually that would put it on a sustainable basis. It would deal with some of the challenges that we have mentioned. But that I also believe that if we don't secure those changes, that actually Britain can prosper and gain influence outside of an unreformed European Union. But make no mistake, I don't think these changes are small things. I don't think they are tinkering at the side. I don't think they're a PR exercise. I think they're fundamental, and I agree with the Prime Minister when we say that they should be fundamental. There are those who would argue that we should stick in no matter what. I don't think that is a negotiating position that many people would take to a table. It is a view that the new business secretary has said, and often I find that the argument that many of those who are saying that we must stay in and that we must secure these reforms is that many of these reforms are things that we've been arguing for 20 years. You know, if you're a geek like me and you've gone through to say the party manifestos of 20, 30 years ago, you actually see that the arguments that we've got to complete the single market, we've got to secure reform of the common agricultural policy. These are many decisions that we have been asking for many changes have been asking for a long time. I think it's about time that we brought that to a head. We either decide what our position is going to be within the European Union, or we decide that it's time that we can actually embrace a globalist future outside of the European Union, but continuing to trade with it. Now, what I would also argue is that whether Britain votes yes or no or remain or leave or in or out, depending on what question we do eventually arrive at, the Eurozone is going to change significantly for many of the reasons that we've just had put forward. The Eurozone is in a state where it is either going to integrate fully, and we're going to see fiscal union outlined in the Five Presidents report, a report which came out to very little fanfare at the time. It was covered in a bit by some of the European press, but it was basically a long-stage plan to deepen economic monetary union, but to deal with some of the fundamental problems, which mean at the moment the Eurozone is not going to grow as it is. It envisages fiscal union, and it envisages an EU treasury. That kind of position, with a voting power of the Eurozone countries together, places a significant challenge to Britain's position within the European Union. And I think that absolutely, regardless of what happens, that when that vote takes place, that a yes vote will be to be part of a European Union with a very integrated Eurozone at the heart of it. Now, one of the reforms that we have always argued, one of the reforms that is in Change or Go, is we have to have very significant protections from the role of the Eurozone, the ability of Eurozone states to outvote the UK and to impose things, certain policies, particularly ones aimed at the City of London, which are not in our interest. I feel that many of the policies that we've seen in the last 4 years that have affected the city would not have been tolerated if it had been the French and the agriculture market. It would not have been the Germans tolerating it if it had been done that to their car market. The same for the Italians with their textiles. And I think particularly when it comes to shipping, and the UK as a seafaring nation has a particular fundamental interest there. Greece has also shown that the problems that can happen. The result of the Greek crisis, whether you get into talking about Greeks overspending, fundamentally it was a problem created by the Eurozone, and it is not going to be a problem solved in the current structure. It is further evidence about why that change is going to happen. Now, whether that change is possible, well, sadly, I have in the last year and a half become more pessimistic about it, because I have watched what was initially a very broad-ranged renegotiation agenda, issues about budget, transparency, protecting the city, opting Britain out of the social chapter, all of the things that David Cameron stood up and said that he wanted to achieve. Those demands have been watered down. To the point that even something which only at the start of 2015 David Cameron said he wanted to see these changes put forward in treaty change, something which I think is fundamental, not only because it means that the changes are permanent. If you saw what happened in the Eurozone crisis and when Britain, after having legal guarantees, was then sucked into bailing out the Eurozone, there is evidence there that if you're going to make any of the changes that we secure in this renegotiation permanent, they have to be backed by treaty change. We've also seen in issues such as migrant benefits, that if you don't have treaty change on the table, it significantly limits the ability to change. I would love to see a change to also sometimes the culture, the fact that the European Parliament has this regulate first, think second policy. That has introduced, just in the last year, damaging rules on VAT, which has forced micro businesses out. You can look at the port services regulation, something which somehow managed to unite the trade unions, the port services authorities and politicians together across a cross-party basis. That is a particularly impressive feat. So for all those reasons, I do think that the EU needs to change. What worries me at the moment is that the ask from Britain is not significant, that those who are convinced that we must stay in no matter what will appear to settle for nothing, or settle for anything. And as famous saying, if you settle for anything, you'll fall for nothing. That's the kind of attitude I feel that sometimes has been taken. And if you look at what was said at the June Council just gone, although it was overshadowed by events in Tunisia, we saw that David Cameron was leaked to be saying that actually the focus of the campaign is going to be about the supposed economic risks of Brexit, not actually about the renegotiation process. Now, as somebody who would like to have a deal that I can vote for, that disappoints me deeply. It is not my default position that I want to get out of the European Union. But I do think that if I am to vote to stay in, the European Union has to change fundamentally, and Britain's relationship with the European Union has to change fundamentally.
Rob, thank you very much. Now straight on to Laura.
Thank you. I represent the European movement, and our position fundamentally is that we are better in, but that every institution, every organisation, particularly any organisation that is regulating and controlling the public and businesses' lives, needs to be in a state of constant reform. It needs to be deeply self-questioning. It needs to have ambition that is on behalf of its members, not on behalf of the institutions themselves. I think I'm not an apologist for Europe. I'm a believer that this country's future is better placed within Europe, but looking outwards. And I think that we have actually gone through probably a 15-year period of where the Commission itself has sort of stagnated, and there's been quite a lot of complacency in what the potential of Europe is internationally. So I am absolutely not apologising for some of the shortcomings that Europe has, as does all institutions that we rely on, as does all organisations in many ways that are controlled by politicians. We need to keep them up to the mark and sharp on some of the issues that really concern us. Change and reform, as it happens before the referendum, I think we're going to find that both the Prime Minister and the agenda that has been set by Britain about having an ambitious, outward-looking and aggressively prosperity-driven agenda is actually being both understood, appreciated, and also supported by many countries. I've had the great pleasure in spending probably far too much time with EU ambassadors and their teams, looking at what issues we can all agree on and what issues we can take forward. And actually, you know, the recognition, the concerns that we have in this country are not so different from others across Europe. Because fundamentally, there are businesses in Europe who feel some of the frustrations that you feel. But they fundamentally feel, as I think that most businesses in the UK feel, and that is that why would you put at risk your existing customer base to achieve new customers? What we need to do is to absolutely build on our current customer base and have ambition for more. I think it's an extraordinary question. There's a zero-sum game that's posed to businesses in the UK, and that is, if we lose, whether it be 40, 45, 47% of our access to a single market, that we are going to be able to gain those markets beyond the European European Union. Why do we not want both? Why aren't we ambitious for it all? Because, to be frank, if you look at what Germany does beyond the European Union, it is absolutely spectacular. And this is something that we need to look at ourselves as much as Europe to say where our ambition needs to lie and what we need to do in terms of trade. I think we've also got to it's an extraordinary time to be looking at exit as well. We've got three, I think, very important reforms that are coming through that we need to be absolutely at the heart of shaping. Number one is the single market in energy, which is going to be extremely important, particularly for high energy users. And will also deliver some consumer benefits. The second is the digital market that was mentioned earlier, which is a huge democratisation of businesses, small businesses, offering them platforms to grow. The third that is particularly important and also deals a lot with the balance of trade issue, and that is the single market in services. This is the big prize for this country. This is the prize that we've been pushing for. Has not come quickly enough. But this is going to be a very, very important platform for us. It's going to be important for our economy. And we need to be at that top table. We need to be negotiating for the right settlement when it comes to the services single market. As somebody amusingly said to me, either you're at the top table or you might just find yourself on the menu. And I think that the services sector in this country does not want to find itself marginalised in that sense. The third element that we've got to consider is not just the reform, what Europe can offer us and its shortcomings, but is also to have a look at this paradise that is being painted of Brexit. I think it's extremely exciting in many ways. It's ambitious. There's an adventure out there to go it and to walk away from what we already have and to go and find new customers, new markets, new trade. And all of those things are possible because I believe in this country as well. But what I would say is that we can be doing that from where we are, not have to walk in many ways into an unknown situation where we are going to have a sort of rebalancing of the economy, whichever way one looks at it, because this paradise is not going to be the paradise from the day after. It will take a good few years, if not, and some people calculated 10 years, of readjusting our economy, of reasserting our trade deals, of recalibrating where we have our relationships. And I'm not sure that I'm prepared to wait for 10 years and have a lost generation as a result. Thank you.
Laura, thank you very much, and all three of you, thank you for those remarks. We're going to take some questions from the floor. You may have noticed some cameras at the back. We are recording this for our website. We've got some roving microphones, so please do wait until the microphone reaches you before you start talking. Otherwise, I'll be in the embarrassing position of asking people probably much more senior than me to repeat themselves. Questions, please. Yeah.
I'll wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much.
Is it working? Is it working?
I think so.
Okay. A very simple question. There's been talk about 46% of the business that is done between the UK and Europe disappearing. Could somebody wiser than me say, what do you think would actually happen? Would 46% disappear? Would it be 40% that would disappear? What would actually disappear on day one? And how would if there was a Brexit, would we get back to that?
Do you want to
Well, it's 46% and shrinking. I think it's the first thing to establish that our trade with the EU is going down. It's probably lower than that when you start thinking about things like the Rotterdam effect, and the fact that much of our trade is actually going further abroad, but it's going via EU ports, such as those in there. How much of it would disappear? Well, I think very little, actually, because ultimately, on the day after a vote out, I suspect that were Germany and the EU to put up, say, tariffs, which we calculated you could work out to be about worth 7 billion, I suspect there'll be a large number of German car manufacturers knocking on Angela Merkel's door saying, why are we now paying tariffs to the UK? Why is it that you've done this? Why is it we do not have a free trade deal? Now, I think you have to accept that if you did have a vote, there would be some disruption. I think anyone who's pretending that isn't going to happen is being slightly hopeful. But the honest question is, what would be the long-term trends? The Open Europe, who is kind of now has morphed into this kind of think tank, which is pro-reform and across the spectrum, they have said it's a range. It depends on what we do back in the UK. Do we deregulate? Do we look at an ambitious approach to the world, to global markets? Do we reorientate our focus of the economy? Then there is a boost to it. If we retreat into isolationism and pull up the drawbridge, then you see a reduction in the amount of GDP and potentially in that trade issue. The only people arguing for us to withdraw in the world isolationism and for drawbridges are the people who are making criticisms of those who believe that we can prosper and gain influence outside the European Union. It's not advocated by anyone else. It's like that trickle-down economics term. You hear people on the right criticise that they argue for trickle-down economics, except no one on the right ever makes that case. It's a criticism put forward by the left. So I actually think that a UK outside of an unreformed European Union could gain influence, could prosper, but a lot of it will depend on the decisions that we make back here. But at the moment, we are not capable of making those decisions. And if we can't get the power back from the European Union to make certain decisions, then I feel that we would be better off making them outside.
Paddy, you're engaged in business across Europe. You've got offices all over Europe. What's your sense?
Well, I think that it's being over-dramatised, isn't it? I think that it seems unlikely that trade flows would change overnight and dramatically as a result of leaving the European Union. That would surprise me. And I think that the point I was trying to make in my opening remarks is that the net effect might be no different to simply going to Europe now and saying, we definitely will never join the EU, so we're outside of that project. We want to be able to sit on the sidelines and only have a limited involvement. And maybe that's the right way for Britain to go. But I think that the idea that we get into this argument, which is all about, I'm going to go to Europe and get a deal out of them because I'm a great leader, is just not realistic. I don't think it reflects the situation Europe's in. I think it's a corner that this country's been painted into by its domestic politics and doesn't reflect the realities of trying to do business in a modern environment. And the idea, I mean, we're a European company, we're based largely on a commercial side in London. I think for 10 years, we shipped nearly 40% of China's crude oil. I mean, the idea that this is about, a sort of total trade relationship, that you only do one thing, or that you're located in one place, therefore you're a British business. For us in shipping, it's not like that. And the idea that the ecozones are crippling us, if you're in international deep sea shipping, it doesn't make any difference. The reality is it occasionally affects you. And ultimately, it's a good leading edge to seeing how that legislation is going to work out when it's eventually brought in globally. So I think all of these things, all these debates tend to get a little bit hyperbolic, overacted.
I mean, I think there are lots of different options for Brexit, and that's one of the issues that need to be bottomed out before, we get to the referendum. Which are the options? So there's, the Norway-Switzerland option, which Ruth talked about, sort of the twilight zone where you're half in and half out. You've absolutely got access to the single market, so that shouldn't impact us in terms of the trade. But what it does do is it impacts us in terms of our sort of influence over what the next stage, what the reform agenda is within Europe. And I think that that's really important when it comes to the services sector in particular. Then there's The Brave New World by Douglas Carswell, sort of, let's be the Hong Kong of Western Europe. Now, that is exciting. I mean, that has got a lot of issues around it, but it is very, very adventurous and very, very ambitious. That then has a very different impact when it comes to issues such as much more sort of open borders and a very, very much more sort of commercial and trading mentality. Now that then I would see that Europe would start to get quite edgy on, because we would probably be lowering some of our employment rights, we'd be changing some of the, dramatically changing our regulation, and I think that they would find that that would be something that wouldn't allow us the same access to the single market. And then you've got a sort of Nigel Farage, back to the past, and that really is, they very, very clearly are saying they want out, 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 and so that doesn't access the trade opportunities in the same way.
Brilliant. We are on a very tight timescale, and we've got our next speaker ready and raring to go. Can I ask, is there another question from the audience? Sorry, Tim, in the corner there.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Tim Springer, Policy Director here at the UK Chamber. We're talking about the Brave New World and when it would take effect. Realistically, if there were a no vote, how long would it take for Britain to extract itself from the European Union? And do you think that it would do so without putting sort of replacement trade deals in place?
Laura?
I think the extraction, what we would, first of all, it is totally unknown, but what we would have to do is extract ourselves, and then there would be pressure to extract ourselves from quite a lot of the legislation, but then we would probably have to reenact quite a lot of the legislation, because actually some of it, there's certainly gold plating, but some of it is just normal business, environmental and employment practice. So we'd be repealing and then reintroducing legislation. I think the issue, if you look at the Swiss model, which is a problem, and that is that each individual business sector has to do its own negotiation with Europe. It is not a block trade deal, and if one was looking for some of the benefits that some people say Switzerland has, then I think that we would be in a very, very long-term situation, sector by sector.
Honestly, I've no idea. I couldn't comment. Completely beyond my.
This is one of those things which divides people's. One of the suggestions is that you'd effectively have most of the European law suddenly ratified and then gradually removed. I think what it would do is it'd lead to a lot of debates in this country about, the future direction of our politics. Should we have the Working Time Directive in its current form because of the effect it has on the NHS? Should we have certain rules which are are hugely damaging to energy-intensive industries and are actually exporting our emissions and jobs and industry outside of the UK? I think it would become, after you've had that vote, a process of what do we want in terms of what makes the UK as an economy grow, rather than just simply wiping the slate clean and then starting from day one. I think it would be a process which would actually end up removing a lot of controls, but there will be certain things that you keep, particularly if you want to keep access to certain markets. But the point I would say now is that we don't have that discussion, we don't have that power, and I hope those are powers that we can bring back one way or another.
That's brilliant. Well, we've just got time to thank our panellists before I hand back to Guy, who will introduce our next speaker. Thank you to Laura, to Rob and to Paddy for your thoughts today. I know you're on the European circuit with these things, so no doubt we'll see you at some event soon. But thank you very much.
Thank you.